Hi, I'm Brent Stafford, and this is RegWatch by RegulatorWatch.com. We're here today at Health Canada's national headquarters in Ottawa, Ontario, for an in-depth discussion, which is an exclusive discussion, with James Van Loon, the Director General of the Tobacco Control Directorate at Health Canada. Thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to meet you.
Now, your name, the title, Director General, what exactly is that?
Director General of a program in the federal government is sort of the captain of a program. In this particular spot, I'm the Director General of the Tobacco Control Program. We're also responsible, as you know, for regulating vaping products. I am the leader for a group of over 100 people, including scientists, regulatory experts, people who specialize in outreach and partnerships and international affairs, all of us working on trying to address the issues of tobacco and vaping control in Canada.
Now, as the regulator, there must be a lot of power and authority there.
Sure. Our job in the Tobacco Control Directorate is to implement the Tobacco and Vaping Products Act, among other things. And that act is the act that sets out all of the regulatory authorities that apply to tobacco and to vaping products.
So the politicians make the law.
Correct.
You make the regulations.
This is it. A law as a whole sets out these broad strokes and these broad prohibitions, and then typically includes what are called regulatory authorities, which are things that say the government may make rules that do this, that, or the other thing. And then we here at the Tobacco Control Directorate prepare those rules for consideration by my bosses and then the minister and then the government, and then they may be finalized and made into rules that apply.
So these kinds of rules, there's a lot of discretion there, isn't there?
There's quite a bit of discretion. There's the different regulatory authorities give different amounts of discretion, but basically the idea is if you are being told you make regulations respecting the sale of something, then there's lots of space to make rules about how that should happen.
Is there a difference in your mind between smoking cigarettes and vaping? Are they two different things?
Absolutely. The law that the government passed last year, the new Tobacco and Vaping Products Act, clearly sets out two different types of products, vaping products and tobacco products, and then applies different sets of rules to them. In our view, so that was new. I've only been here for about a year and a half, and as I came in, I was taking charge of trying to get that act through, or support our minister in getting that act through Parliament. And it was very clear that what we're trying to do there is provide access to a lower risk alternative for adult smokers, while still trying to prevent any sort of corollary risks that might happen because young people started using the product. Right. In the form of vaping. So see them as quite different, and certainly for people who are able to switch completely to vaping from their current tobacco smoking habit, less harmful.
Vaping is safer than smoking.
I try to avoid the word safer because neither of them is safe, but less harmful.
Clearly there is a big issue going on right now with youth vaping. I believe you've described it to the industry as an existential crisis or threat.
It's certainly a very, very big issue. I actually remember the conversation that you're referring to there. It was right after the FDA had called this an existential threat. What I was trying to convey to the industry in that conversation, what I think is still true, is that the level of concern here is just as high. We are aware of some evidence that suggests that there is a rapid increase in the rate of youth use of vaping products, and that's something that we find very alarming. So yes, that is a challenge that we're facing.
Yeah, I mean, I have to ask you, what is the data that supports that level of alarm in Canada? Mm-hmm. Because even David Hammond told us that mostly the data that he's got mirrors the US, but it's not public yet. And so if the data isn't public yet, how do we know that there is the alarm? Yeah,
so, I mean, David has, I'll take a step back on that. Actually, we have data going back many, many years on rates of vaping in Canada. We have a couple of national level surveys that suggest, or that canvass people for how much smoking is going on, how much vaping use. One is the Canadian Tobacco Alcohol Drug Survey. One is the Canadian Student Tobacco Alcohol Drug Survey. In the previous cycles of those, CTADs had showed a fairly consistent level of vaping, but the Canadian Student Tobacco Alcohol Drug Survey had shown a substantial increase over the previous 2 years leading up to 2017. And that was about 30% a year. So we knew there was an upward trend, We're also carefully watching what's going on in the United States, because a lot of the same products are available, and the kids all speak the same language, and oftentimes things follow along in Canada from what's happened in the US first. So that's alarming. And then David Hanman came and showed us his, as yet as far as I know, unpublished data, but that showed similar trends in Canadian youth use of vaping products as what had been seen in the US. So that was enough for us to feel like there's a substantial cause, and certainly our minister feels there's a substantial cause for concern here, and that's why we've been looking at the additional measures that we can take to try to put additional pressure downwards on youth uptake of vaping.
So let's talk about that. What are those measures? I know that right now it's consultation, so what have you asked of industry and what are you looking at?
Yeah, so first of all, I'll just point out that the Tobacco and Vaping Products Act contains a bunch of prohibitions right there in the Act. There's no lifestyle advertising for vaping products. There can't be endorsements, there can't be testimonials, there can't be sponsorship, a whole bunch of the types of controls that are intended to stop people from being induced to try products who are not already using nicotine. What we published in February is a notice of intent, which sets out like a bunch of regulatory possibilities that focus on additional advertising restrictions for vaping products. For instance, restrict where point-of-sale advertising would be acceptable for vaping products. So right now, you don't have any point-of-sale advertising for tobacco, and yet in many jurisdictions in Canada, you would see point-of-sale advertising for vaping products. And so it would say, all right, well, the proposal in that notice of intent is if people under the age of 18 are allowed in the store, then you can't have point-of-sale advertising.
So the idea here is that the kind of ubiquity of that kind of promotion and advertising is one that it would be hard to not be seen by youth.
Exactly. The idea is to try to reduce youth exposure to vaping, or to vaping product advertising that might make the product seem appealing to them. And so there are these spaces where you frequently have youth in the candy aisle at a convenience store, and then at the end of the aisle there might be a poster or whatever it is. So point of sale advertising in places where you have people who are under the age of 18 would be restricted in this proposal.
Right. So when you say appealing, these ads could be appealing. From RegWatch's point of view, we would use the word normalizing. Now, of course, to youth, you don't want to normalize vaping to youth, but you certainly want to normalize vaping to smokers and for all of their friends and family, and for the rest of the majority of people who believe vaping is as harmful as smoking. Don't you want to normalize it for them?
I certainly want to make sure that we can be clear. If you go and look on Health Canada's webpage about vaping, we are very clear. We see vaping as less harmful than smoking. People who switch completely are substantially reducing their exposure to a large number of different toxicants. And that's a very good thing. Whether at point of sale advertising in convenience stores is the right way to deliver that message, I don't know.
There's a lot of pressure, I would say, that's popped out onto regulators in the last year, obviously, clearly. Where is that pressure coming from?
Well, a big part of it is our own reaction to the data that we're becoming aware of about rapid increases in the youth use of these products. That is very concerning, and I think Canadians would be upset if we didn't treat that with due concern. Certainly there are stakeholders out there who are also sounding alarms on this, as there are others who are saying everybody should just take it easy here for a moment. And we are interested in all of those perspectives when we are putting forward a regulatory consultation like the one that's out now.
How are things different a year later, year and a half later, from when you took over? Certainly we're in the position where the industry was promised, I know because we've been covering it, Health Canada promised that the TVPA would provide a stable regulatory framework. And it's not even 12 months since it became law, and it seems that it's so stable that it's falling apart already in terms of pressure on the industry, right?
So you're kind of saying, why wasn't there more protection there in terms of, well, we will resist this trend? But we're not responding to hysteria, we're responding to evidence that suggests that lots of young people are trying these products, and wanting to make sure that we maintain this balance between offering access of a less harmful product to adult smokers and protecting young people from inducement to use vaping products, addiction to nicotine, other health risks that might be associated there.
Right.
So what we're doing right now is reacting to the changing environment that's happened over the last year. And that's what the government said it would do when putting the act through Parliament. There were many voices saying, why aren't you going all the way? Why aren't you implementing the full regulatory suite of controls on advertising for vaping that you have for tobacco? And the case was, we want to make sure that it's possible for smokers to find out about these products. But if the evidence suggests that we need to move farther, the regulatory authorities are in the act, and then those proposals would come forward. And I think that's what you're seeing the government looking at now.
So you said Health Canada is reacting to I use hysteria. Other people have used hysteria too as well. And the reason why is because if you take any look at the way in which the media, the mainstream media, has been covering this, it is a full-blown moral panic. The fad of Juul, is part, teens love, if anybody's done enough to advertise and market for Juul, it's been the media, the mainstream news, right? So my question then is that how does Health Canada separate the effect that the media might be having on this whole phenomenon?
Our objective is to continue to watch all of the emerging evidence, and whether that's an initial suggestion of some possible health effect or like a recent clinical trial on the effectiveness in vaping and helping smokers get off cigarettes. We're watching it all and responding and designing regulatory interventions to accommodate or to address the issues as we see them. Yes, there is a lot of news about it. Yes, we watch it, but our approach is evidence-based.
So, who are the bad players in Canada? Are there any?
I wouldn't single out anybody as a bad player. We have had numerous instances to provide like a compliance letter to somebody. As with the new piece of legislation, it is often the case that you will spend a little bit of time at the front end ensuring people understand their obligations and doing compliance promotion. But occasionally you have to issue a letter saying that that's not compliant. And what we've seen thus far is lots of folks moving into compliance upon being advised. So I wouldn't single anyone out as, oh, you're a bad player.
Well, because we've spoken with Michael Purley, had a great interview with him, and other people in tobacco control speak a lot about big tobacco. And even inside the vaping industry, there seems to be quite a big turn in terms of wanting to make sure they clearly are separating themselves from the big tobacco players. Is there a position that Health Canada has on big tobacco being involved in the vaping business?
No. It has implications. For instance, Canada is a signatory to the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. There's rules in that Framework Convention that say when you're thinking about public health policy, you have to isolate it from the vested interests of the tobacco industry. So it has implications for the importance of transparency in any dealings that we have with the industry. But we're not here to say these people are not allowed to own those shares.
How strong is the evidence that nicotine is dangerous?
The evidence that nicotine is addictive is extremely strong and creates a very, very strong addiction. If you look at the purposes of the Tobacco and Vaping Products Act, it's really about, with respect to vaping, it's really about ensuring that young people and non-smokers are protected from inducements to use nicotine products, from being misled about the health effects of vaping products. It's in that range. And ultimately to protect from any health effects of vaping that there are. Our principal concern in that area today is nicotine addiction among those who wouldn't have become addicted to nicotine, and then in a worst case scenario, people moving on to use tobacco. There is, again, like I've seen some of the interviews that you've conducted with others asking about what do you think of this idea of nicotine can have effects on the brain development in young people. Again, this is a place where we take a look at the evidence and try to figure out what the right response is. In this particular case, we see animal studies, we see we have a good sense that that nicotine can potentiate addiction. Certainly people who try it earlier in life are more likely to become long-term users of nicotine. So we're looking at the evidence that's there. Those are the types of things that we're responding to.
Right. On your website now, because there has been some changes since even from October of last year to now, with regard to the teen stuff, there's a bunch more layers and some communications on youth vaping prevention. It does say on the main page that vaping causes lung damage. And I was wondering about that.
Again, we're kind of looking at the available evidence there. We have evidence, and by the way, like when we're talking about sort of scientific evidence about health impacts of vaping, it's not, we have, as I said, a team of scientists whose job is to conduct some of their own research and largely to monitor the massive flows of research that are going on in these areas. But we also have a science advisory board that is consisting of people from all over, including the UK and the US, to help us to interpret this data. When we talk with them about these things, we see things like sort of cellular inflammation as a result of exposure to vaping, and it's an indicator of potential long-term health impacts. And so based on that sort of thing, we think it's important to provide clear messaging that says this can be harmful.
Do you think the average Canadian is getting the information that vaping is a, what did we say, less harmful alternative, right? Not safer. Do you think that message is getting out to regular Canadians?
I hope so, in that we are trying to clearly communicate smokers who switch completely to vaping are reducing their risk. That's a less harmful way of consuming nicotine. So we're saying it. Others can say it. You can't say it as part of a promotion of a product, but like a scientist can say that, media can say that. We want to make sure that it's delivered in a way that it's not just engineered to sell something.
So Health Canada put out some health statements. These are statements of kind of health benefits kind of idea that could be used by industry and I guess other Canadians and stuff like that. What are those for those that don't know, and what's the status of those?
So the Act prohibits anybody making any comparative statements comparing the health effects or the emissions of vaping products to those of tobacco. But it allows regulations to be made that would authorize certain statements to be made. The idea there, once again, being to make sure that people are not being misled by cherry picking of certain statements or whatever. I don't know how you might spin something, versus getting clean information about the relative risks here.
Right.
Health Canada, I guess it was around August, sent a targeted consultation to stakeholders saying, here are a few things that we might authorize you saying. I wish I had actually brought them with me.
Yeah, actually, I do have them here because they're kind of important to have out. A lot of people are excited by them. Let me just see. Here they go.
Yes, so the first one there, if you are a smoker, switching completely to vaping is a much less harmful option. That was one. And we think the science substantiates that. These are largely, by the way, developed or derived from this massive study undertaken by the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine in the US last year, which is now a year old. And as I said, science is evolving extremely fast in this area, but remains a fairly definitive compendium of what we know about vaping.
Sure.
And so that's where we derived those from, and we sent those out as a consultation. As I said, we would need to make a regulation to authorize the use of these in the promotion for sale of a vaping product.
So they're not yet then available then?
They're not yet available. Over the last 6 months, our focus has turned to what can we do on the youth vaping side because of the alarming evidence that we had seen. But these remain something that we are working on. So we'll get there.
Right. So that's, I guess, part of the issue is that so much oxygen gets drawn out of the room because of the youth issue that it completely stops, progress on other areas. How can anybody learn anything positive about vaping if it's literally against the law to say that vaping is better for you than smoking. And you have a media, which, God bless them, seem to really truly believe that vaping is the worst thing in the world. Doesn't matter for who you are. So if we're to rely on the media to tell the story about vaping being less harmful, no one's ever going to know.
What I would do is encourage folks to go and look at Health Canada's information for smokers who are interested in vaping as an alternative. We're quite clear that we see vaping as less harmful than smoking. It's not against the law to say vaping is less harmful than smoking. We are doing it. It's against the law to promote a product using a relative risk statement. That's a paraphrase. It's in the Act, but people with a scientific opinion, people who are not promoting a product, certainly can be delivering that kind of message to smokers.
Now that's a good point to make sure it's clear, because within the vaping community, they look at the no comparisons clause and it says no person shall. Mm-hmm. And when you look at the Act, it defines what an entity is, it defines what a manufacturer is, it defines what a retailer is. Mm-hmm. It makes all those distinctions, and then when it gets to the no comparison, it says person.
Yeah, that is in the promotion section of the Act, and there's a section at the front of the promotion section of the Act that explains that, like, academic papers and opinions and
literary
stuff are not subject to that prohibition.
So a regular Canadian, blasting out their opinion on Facebook or whatever, that's all fine.
As long as they're not being paid.
What if they work in the vaping industry?
Then so I'm not going to get into interpreting and going, okay, well, what about this and what about that? Promotion of a product using those statements is not currently allowed.
One of the big things that the industry is telling us, like, we know, we've been covering this now over the last 5-6 weeks in this special coverage that we're doing. The special coverage only exists because this issue has popped up and there is some crisis that's happening. And as the industry is scrambling to try to respond, the Canadian Vaping Association has made a submission. They've talked about how promotion and advertising are something that they feel is detrimental to vaping, and would like to work with Health Canada on that. They've also mentioned that online sales are an important part of vaping community and people's access to vaping products, and are working with Canada Post on that. We had the representative from C-Stores in Ontario on our show, who could logically speak for most of the C-Stores in the country, and was very adamant that the point of sale marketing and everything else is very important to have in their stores, and that the ubiquity and access of C-Stores is extremely important for converting smokers. And then we had Michael Purley on our show, famous tobacco controller and genuinely honest person who says that C-stores are a problem, the promotion and marketing are a problem, and believes that vaping is something that's good for smokers, and recommends specialty vape stores. So there's a bit of a milieu, obviously, of differing opinions, which certainly are competitive in some extent and exclusionary in the others. And you have to review all that. I'm certain that you probably can't speak directly to any one of those yet, but I know that you've written a white paper so you've spent some time looking deeply at this stuff. What can you share with our viewers about that?
Well, certainly we have received several hundred comments back on the notice of intent that was published back in February about various promotions. And you're right that some of the comments say you absolutely must allow X, and other ones say you absolutely must not allow X. This is not new for regulators. We consult regularly as part of the regular process of doing a regulation. And we have to reconcile and try to consider what the evidence says vis-a-vis those opinions, and determine what to do. But until we figure out what that proposal is going to be, I'm not exactly sure how we've decided to reconcile all those things.
There's a lot of responsibility on the regulator to help sort this out. We haven't discussed yet is the parents, because there are parents for these youth. What role do they have? Absolutely,
I think parents have a critical role to play in all of these things. One of the first, Health Canada has been engaging not only in regulatory activities, but also in outreach. There's various ads out there trying to inform people about the risks of vaping, especially at young people. One of the first things we did there is create sort of a web page for adults, for parents and educators, to provide them with the information that we have that they could then relay on to kids. I have to do it in my own house, talk to my 14-year-olds about what this all means and what it means for them when they're kind of saying, you know, here's what we see and what do you think? And what I tell them is the same thing I tell you, which is that these products are less harmful alternatives for people who smoke cigarettes, but not a wise choice for a young person.
So for vapors out there, can they be reassured for adult vapors? Can they be reassured that there's going to be a vaping industry for them in a year from now?
Yeah, the policy objective remains that there should be a less harmful alternative for those unwilling or unable to quit nicotine. So that remains important. I think you can expect, though, that as long as we continue to see rapidly increasing youth uptake of these products, governments will be very focused on that. And I think most parents and most Canadians would expect that.
If there's one thing that parents, educators, people in the vaping industry, and those special interests who are not particularly friendly to vaping, what would you like all of them to know about what Health Canada is doing over the next 12 months?
I would like them to know that we take the emerging issue of lots of young people trying vaping very seriously and are moving with all due speed to find the right solutions to that issue. At the same time, I do think it's important to continue to remind, especially smokers, that switching completely to vaping is a less harmful alternative for them.